Welcome to Sex and Happiness with Laurie Handlers. Amazing sex and intimacy are just around the corner. While Laurie puts the finishing touches on her new book, Sex and Happiness Over 60, please enjoy this show. It's one of her favorites from the Sex and Happiness archives.
I don't know if you've ever considered how suppressed sexuality is in our world. It certainly is in the U.S. based on our Puritan forefathers and mothers, and perhaps the attitudes in some European countries are a little bit more permissive or more relaxed. I've had that experience in the UK, I've had that experience in France, and certainly I've had that experience. I wasn't in Russia, but I've had that experience in Russian culture. But think about the rest of the world, African countries, the Middle East. Inside many of these countries, sex can't be discussed. The mores are definitely anything but relaxed. Certainly in India, boys and girls aren't even allowed to hold hands. So Baba Dez is an internationally renowned speaker and teacher. He's a Dhaka, an author, and a singer-songwriter. He's a transformational guide, and he's trained both in sacred temple arts and in ways to support others integrate their divine masculine and feminine. Baba Dez has just returned from this amazing world tour. I actually have seen him since he came back from this tour, and I was so blown away by what he's attempting to do. I said to him, you've got to get back on my show right away. So welcome back to the show, Baba Dez. Thank you for being with me.
Hi, thank you, Laurie.
Yeah, you're welcome. There's a lot of sexual suppression and repression in our world, and I want to know a little bit more about what you're setting out to do and how big is the task, how long is it going to take, why are you doing it? Tell me about that, will you?
Well, basically for me, it's about creating the kind of world that I want to live in. So, of course, that starts right here at home. And I've been on my own journey and walking that road for a long time. And what I've noticed is that there's other people that are wanting help and support in this as well. And especially people who have been facilitating others in sexual wholeness and stepping back into their power. It's interesting. There's just so many threads of the guilt, shame, and fear that you were mentioning, and how it permeates our world in different cultures. And even people where there's a lot more sexual freedom and freedom to talk about things, there are still so many underlying threads of guilt, shame, and fear that people aren't even consciously aware of. So
right.
let me start out just by saying that one of my biggest visions is to bring the temples forward on the planet, that there used to be temples all around the world in many major cultures. And these temples were places of higher learning, of creating more well-being for their communities, and health on every level of being, not just physical, but emotional, mental, spiritual, sexual, and vibrant health and vibrancy for the tribes and communities that the temples were a part of. And what I notice is that the temple starts right here inside of all of us. Each one of us is a temple, and so
okay.
that's where the work starts.
Now, when you say temple, do you mean it in the literal sense, like a temple, a synagogue, a church, a place of worship? Is that what you mean, like a worship of the self inside, the
yes,
temple inside?
Exactly, and the temples that manifest externally in our communities as gathering places are reflections of the inner temples that we build inside of our own beings.
And I guess it's the obvious, but I'm going to state it anyway, that the places where we were brought up to go to these sacred places turned out to turn us against ourselves. They didn't have us worshiping ourselves as God or ourselves as worthy, our bodies inside, outside as being worthy of something to regard in a sacred and high way.
Well, I totally agree, Laurie. And basically what has happened is that the temples kind of got taken over, and they got used for a different purpose. And rather than celebrating and being a reflection of all of our own divine connections, oftentimes a lot of the temples that were really supporting people in their individual power were basically destroyed. The priests and priestesses were scattered. And the temple arts had to go underground, because the temple arts are really all about empowering individuals. And a lot of the places and organizations and religions and things that took over the temples and kind of used the temple format, what they did was they became emissaries of putting themselves in between people and God.
Right. Wow. That's a beautiful expression right there. It's so simplistic. It's so easy to follow. Yes, they put themselves in, and they became the agents of, and whatever they made up, maybe they did have visions in the beginning.
Exactly.
Maybe they were mystics, but later they became more like business people and politicians. And they put themselves in between, kind of like lawyers put us in between our power, our power to argue, or doctors become the expert on my body when in fact I'm really the expert on my body.
Well,
so
it's the same thing. The temples are supposed to be there to support us all with our own individual God connection, and the government is supposed to be there to support us. The government is there to serve us, as
right.
There to serve us. And what happened was a power play happened, and what happened was it turned out that people were there more to support the temples, and the temples or the government is there to support us.
Yeah, amazing how we can be so co-opted. So this is great. So what we were talking about and where we're leading to was you were talking about how the temple starts inside.
Right.
The temple of the sacred space and the worship starts inside of the body and the self, and then starts expanding into our world. So can you take that a step further for me?
Well, yeah, it's basically the whole idea of a holographic universe, and that, of course, if we want to change the world, then we need to look inside and make the changes that are going to create that kind of shift in the world, and to be consciously aware of where guilt, fear, and shame have disconnected us from our truth, from our life force energy. And when I talk about life force energy, our life force energy, as shamanically speaking, is very much in parallel with our sexual energy. That our sexual energy and our life force energy are really the same thing. And
right.
it's from that place that we actually cultivate our power, and we are able to manifest the kind of worlds and the kind of bodies and the kind of relationships and jobs and abundance and health and everything else that we are wanting to attract in our lives.
Well, I agree with you, wholeheartedly. I wanted to just say something about guilt, fear, and shame. I don't know if I've ever said this to you before. I might have. Fear is a real response, and fear is something that is in the body, and it lets us know whether we should fight or run. When there's real danger and threat, like a dinosaur is going to eat us, and we better run. But guilt and shame and fear is used, we've been trained so that we fear everything, all kinds of things now. So it's not like just a biological response anymore. But guilt and shame, I've often thought that they're not even emotions. They're like a secondary thing that was introduced by the culture, each culture in its own way, to keep us in check. But it's not, there's no, an amoeba doesn't feel guilty or ashamed. Horses, a few years ago I hung around like people, who were doing horsey stuff down in Palm Beach area of Florida. And horses being jumped over a very high hurdle, still take a poop right there while they're going over the hurdle. The horse doesn't feel guilty or ashamed. that the horse just defecated in front of a whole audience. It's only humans that feel guilt and shame. It's not a real body response. It's not real. It's manufactured.
Right. Well, and I feel like that's kind of that's what we're needing to realize is that, you know, as human beings, one of our gifts is conscious awareness. And like any organism, the human beings are still a living organism, living creatures, and so we still have that primal connection to fear. And yet guilt and shame is something that is something that happens with conscious awareness. And it's one of the things that we need to be consciously aware of, because we can, just as we can be run by our fear that isn't rational or real, we can be run we can also be run by our guilt and our shame. And that's basically what a lot of organized religions have done, that they've used guilt and shame and fear to basically disconnect us from our power so that we could be manipulated.
Right. It's such a shame. So here we are. That's what brings us together, you and I, and many other people, in our own efforts to do something about it. And it's really, I mean, for me, I started out in my own quest about it, and I imagine you did the same thing, like trying to shake off the oppression that you felt in your life from this. And then as you grew, you decided to branch out. Is that...
Yeah, absolutely. Branch out. And you know, what happens is that as I step more into my power and I create the healing in my being, we are, as human beings, we're social beings. And so it's great if I'm free, but I want my people to be free too. And I want us to celebrate our freedom together and our ease and our beauty and our abundance and our health. And it does, you know, it breaks my heart to see my people suffering, my family in pain, or you know, from different things. So, you know, it happens on many different levels. Helping my family and my father and my mother and aunts and uncles and brothers and sisters, to support them to eat a healthy diet so that they're feeling better, so they're not ending up in the hospital with a coronary. For them to really look at turn over the stones in their life and look what's underneath, as far as how they've been conditioned in a culture that is very entrenched with guilt and fear and shame around who they are as sexual beings. And, you know, you started out the show by talking about how in some places people can't even talk about these things. Well, right here in the United States, it's very difficult for people to talk about these things. And so, and yet it's really important that we talk about these things, because this is the essence of our power. This is oftentimes the stuff that's actually breaking up and destroying relationships and creating all kinds of problems on many levels of our human experience. And one of the biggest forms of abuse is that when we as young adults start stepping into our power and start stepping into our sexual awakening, we're virtually met with silence and ignorance as far as information on who we are as powerful sexual beings.
Right. So, they just tell us to just say no. They tell us to just say no. They can't even. I did an earlier show where there was a sex educator who said, you know, she couldn't have prophylactics, you know, packages of rubbers anywhere near the school that she went in to talk. She couldn't even talk about that with the students. So you couldn't. You're spot on about this point.
Let's take it back even further. What about just being able to teach young men about ejaculatory choice, so they're not running around ejaculating and impregnating young women? If men learned ejaculatory choice when they were young men, then there's a case for even prophylactics not being so necessary as far as birth control goes. I know that there's another issue around disease, but that's something else.
Yeah.
What I'm talking about is understanding at a very early age how to cultivate, circulate, hold, and direct our sexual energy. So if we have that kind of awareness in our energy bodies and in our physical bodies, then what that does is energy and emotions, we know now, this is what's really exciting. We know that our thoughts and our emotions affect matter. Quantum physics is proving that. So all these things that we've known for thousands of years as shamans and guides and tantrikas, these worlds, the scientific world and the spiritual world, are finally agreeing on these things. And so if we bring in energy mastery and we understand